Well, welcome to part 5 of the Sunday School series. This particular week is actually about the life of Moses, and it's going to be split into 2 different parts. So this is part 5.1, I guess. Next week we'll have part 5.2. But this series has been all about those stories that if you grew up in Sunday school, you heard. They come from the Bible. They're part of the Christian history. The things that really happened in the history of our faith. And so they're important for us as the people of God to know these stories. But we don't talk about them with adults very much. And so that means that for those of you who came to faith as an adult, or maybe you're not quite there yet and you're still checking things out, these are stories from the Bible that you may not have ever even had the chance to hear. And so we're spending a lot of weeks. This is the longest series we've ever done as a church. Exploring the stories of the Bible, the hallmark stories of the Christian faith. And so I'm glad to have you part of that journey. So far, we've covered the creation story where we learned that God created a very good world and that He created a very good, perfect world on purpose and with purpose. But that then sin messed up that purpose and turned a very good world very bad. And it got so bad that in the second week, we learned about the story of Noah and the flood, where God decided to wipe out all evil off of the face of the earth and saved humanity through one man in a wooden boat. And we learned that that's a picture of Jesus, as He was one man who saved all of humanity on a wooden cross. If you missed those, you can go and catch those. But then we jumped out of, on our website. My bad, I didn't finish my sentence. You can go and catch those on our website. But then we moved out of Genesis for a week and went to one of the oldest stories in the Bible, even though it's placed at almost the middle of the Bible. It's one of the oldest stories. And that's the story of Job, who lost everything. He lost his family. He lost everything he owned, and asked the questions that you and I ask when we have bad things happen in our lives. The questions like, why? Why is this happening? And he found peace in those questions through a very simple answer that was just this: what is unknown to us is not unknown to God. When we don't know the answers, God does. And then last week, we jumped back into Genesis with the story of Joseph and the coat of many colors. You may have, even if you aren't connected to the church or haven't grown up in the church, there's a good chance that you're at least somewhat familiar with the title of that story, Joseph and the coat of many colors. And we learned that Joseph is a picture of Jesus, who used his great authority with great generosity. And today we're picking up where Genesis left off in Exodus. And so we are going to spend the next 2 weeks in Exodus. And that's just because there are so many stories in Exodus that we can't just tackle them all in 1 week. In fact, we could spend almost a whole year on this book. I mean, this has stories like the birth of Moses, the burning bush, the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, the Passover, manna from heaven, water from a rock, the 10 Commandments, the golden calf, and so many others. And we're covering it all in 2 weeks, so buckle up, because we've got a lot to cover today, but I think that we're going to get a lot out of it. And I did my best to not overwhelm us with too many readings. So what I've done is, if you've watched my sermons before, I try to read through everything that we're going to be learning about, even if it's a really long chunk of scripture. But I didn't think that reading 18 chapters today would be a good idea. So I went and I made selected readings. But I would encourage you this week to go and read chapters 1 through 18, because that we get almost that far in the message today. And it would be good for you to know all of the details in between the pieces that I pulled out for our readings today. So we're going to be breaking this into 2 parts this week and next week. The first part takes us from the birth of Moses through the Exodus out of Egypt and into the desert. And then the second part will start at the covenant of Sinai and then go through the creation and construction of the tabernacle. If you don't know what those things are, don't worry. We're going to get into that and you'll know everything you need to know. But we're going to start at the beginning of Exodus. And Exodus 1 actually picks up where we left off last week. So that means that we need a little bit of background before we can really understand everything that's happening in this story. And it starts, the background for what we learned today actually starts all the way back in the Garden of Eden, the very first week of this series, where God gave Adam and Eve a blessing and a command. He told them to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it. He wanted his people to be great. And then with Noah, the same promise was reaffirmed. The same command was reaffirmed with Noah when God told Noah to do the same thing, to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And then Abraham was promised almost the same thing when he was promised a whole bunch of offspring that would turn into a great nation that would be a blessing to all the earth. And so the story traces then from Abraham to Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And last week we studied Joseph. And so as that promise is traced through those generations, Joseph leads us to a place where he is the second in command in Egypt and saves his family from famine. Go and check that on our website if you missed it. It's an incredible story of God's faithfulness to his people. And so after saving his family from famine as second in command in Egypt, the entire family of Joseph, 70 people, moved to Egypt and live in Egypt under Joseph's kind rule. And so that's where we left off last week at the end of Genesis. And Exodus picks up from this right at that exact place. And actually it's interesting because Exodus begins with the word "and." Most books don't begin with the word "and," but this one starts with "and" because it is the continuation of the historical account of Genesis. It expects that you read it after you've read Genesis. So it says, "And these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. Each came with his family." The King James Version says "now." Most translations just drop the word "and" because it sounds weird in English to start that way. But the reason for it in the original language was that it was continuing from Joseph. "And these are the names of the sons of Israel," who was Joseph's father, "who came to Egypt with Jacob. Each came with his own family." In fact, the Hebrew name for the book of Exodus isn't actually Exodus. It's Ve'ele Shemot, which means "and these are the names," or most often it's just shorted to the Shemot, or the names. And it gets that name for the book because of what it says in the beginning, "and these are the names." So we call it Exodus because of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. I know there's a lot of Bible jargon in here. For those of you who have been in the church, you might be more familiar with this stuff, so you're eating this up. If you're not as familiar with this, don't worry. Just take some notes and ask me questions later. So the Exodus is the second book of the Torah, known as the Shemot in Hebrew, but in English we call it the Exodus because that's what it was called in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the first 5, actually the whole Old Testament. Was the Septuagint. I think it's a better name anyway, Exodus, better than Shemot, but Shemot does sound cool, so I wanted to share that with you. So Exodus begins with the word "and" because it is a continuing of the account of Genesis. And Exodus tells us the names of the people who came with Jacob to Egypt to live under Joseph's rule. And then in verse 6, it fast forwards through that generation and says, "Then Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were fruitful, increased rapidly, multiplied, and became extremely numerous, so that the land was filled with them." Now remember the blessing and command that was given in Eden and to Noah and to Abraham, and that was to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, to become a great nation. And now the Israelites had done exactly that in Egypt. But there was a problem. There was a new king in town. The old king had died along with this generation of Joseph and his brothers and father and mother. And the new king didn't know Joseph. It says a new king who had not known Joseph came to power in Egypt. Kind of like when you get a new boss and the new boss you don't have the same rapport with him like you did with the old boss. And that can cause some problems, can't it, once in a while? And so that's kind of what happened. There started to be some problems because the new king didn't know the Hebrew or Israelite people the way that the old king did because of Joseph. And so he sees the Hebrews multiplying, and he doesn't like it. As their population increased, their popularity decreased. And so he said to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and powerful than we are. Let us deal shrewdly with them. Otherwise, they will multiply further, and if war breaks out, they may join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country. So the Egyptians assigned taskmasters over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor. Now, a conservative estimate is that they had grown to around 2 million people from the 70 that had initially come with Joseph. And that is based on an account later in Exodus that says that there were 600 men. And so if you estimate the number of women and children, you get a conservative estimate of about 2 million people that they had become over the last 100 or 200 years. And so Pharaoh didn't like that. And so he started forcing them to work as slaves, and he drove them very, very hard. And he was hoping that would cause them to decrease in number, stop having as many kids, and that then they would be more dependent on Israel so that they would actually stay. But that didn't work. The Hebrew population still continued to grow. And so the Pharaoh decided to do something very, very evil. And this is important to remember because it matters later in the story. He commanded the Hebrew midwives to throw any male baby into the Nile River as soon as they were born in order to try to control the population. But the Hebrew midwives refused to do that, and that upset Pharaoh, and so he called them to him and he asked them, why didn't you do what I asked you to do, to kill the Hebrew baby boys? And basically, well, what they said is probably one of my favorite responses in the Bible. They said to Pharaoh, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before a midwife can get to them. In other words, I don't know what to tell you, king. The Hebrew women are tougher than the Egyptian women. They just make it happen before we can get there. It's hilarious. But what happened next is not funny in any way at all. Pharaoh commanded all his people, you must throw every son to the Hebrews into the Nile, but let every daughter live. But there was one brave mother who, when she gave birth, she saw it was a boy. And it says the woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with asphalt and pitch. She placed the child in it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. Then his sister stood at a distance in order to see what would happen to him. Pharaoh's daughter went down to bathe at the Nile while her servant girls walked along the riverbank. Seeing the basket among the reeds, she sent her slave girl to get it. When she opened it, she saw the child, a little boy, crying. She felt sorry for him and said, this is one of the Hebrew boys. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay your wages. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. Moses means to draw out. That's what his name means. And that would make sense to you if you're familiar with the rest of the story, because eventually Moses draws out the Israelites, the Hebrew people, out of slavery and into the desert. Side note, though, it's funny to me that it mentions that baby Moses was beautiful. Did you catch that? It says that the woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. Now, that's funny to me because do you know who wrote Exodus? Well, it was Moses. So Moses wanted to be sure that we knew that he was a pretty baby, right? Like more than that, several thousand years later. I mean, we are we now know that Moses was a beautiful baby because his mama thought so. I thought that was kind of funny. It makes me chuckle when I read it. But now we've met Moses, right? And so he's the most important person in Exodus. And over the next 40 years of his life, he would grow up as an Egyptian, even though he was a Hebrew. But since he was adopted, he grew up as an Egyptian. In fact, according to the ancient Jewish historian Josephus, this Pharaoh didn't have any sons. And so Moses, being the adopted grandson of the Pharaoh, meant that he was the next heir to the throne. But when Moses grew up, he learned that he was a Hebrew. And when he saw the way that the Egyptians were treating the Hebrews, he got really angry. And in fact, one day he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew very badly. And so he killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. It says that he looked this way and that way, but I guess he forgot to look that way because somehow word got out. And Pharaoh got really mad that Moses had killed one of the Egyptians for beating a Hebrew. And so Moses had to flee Egypt. And he fled a really long way to Midian, where he met a man named Jethro, who was a sheep farmer and priest. And he married his daughter. So he married the farmer's daughter. And I just have to say, I think Jethro might be the best name possible for a sheep farmer. It just sounds like it matches, doesn't it? So he marries Jethro's daughter, and while he's there one day, he's tending the sheep, and he walks them to Mount Horeb. And if you're familiar with your biblical geography, you'll know that Mount Horeb is known as the mountain of God, because while Moses was there walking the sheep, he spotted a bush that was on fire. But what he noticed that caught his attention was that even though the bush was on fire, the bush wasn't being consumed by the fire. It stayed perfectly fine. So he walked up to it to investigate what was going on. And so it says, when he gets closer, that God called out to him from the bush. It says, when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called out to him from the bush, "Moses, Moses." "Here I am," he answered. "Do not come closer," he said. "Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Then he continued, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, "I have observed the misery of my people in Egypt, and I have heard them crying out because of their oppressors. And I know about their sufferings. I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them to that land, to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. The territory of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. The Israelites' cry for help has come to me, and I have also seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore go, I am sending you to Pharaoh so that you may lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." And so Moses responded to this perhaps a lot like how we might. I mean, he had just been asked to go to the king of one of the most powerful nations in the world, if not the most powerful nation in the world at that time, and tell him that a talking bush told him that he needed to release all of his slave laborers. And so naturally, he responded with some questions. And his first question was, if I go to the Israelites and I say to them, "The God of your fathers has sent me to you," and they ask me, "What is his name?" what should I tell them? So God replied to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you." God also said to Moses, "Say this to the Israelites. Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is how I am to be remembered in every generation." Now, this is important. We could spend an entire sermon series just on this one "I am" statement, where God reveals his name to us. And maybe we will sometime, but for now, let's take a shallow dive into what this means. For now, know this: it is the personal name of our God. It basically means, I am whatever you need me to be. I am whatever I need to be. The words I am are actually a weird tense that actually mean I am and I will be and I have been all at the same time. And so in this name, I am, we get a picture of the God who is and who was and is to come that we see in Revelation 1:8. This is the Hebrew word hayah, and it means I am. It is the personal name that God calls himself. But it didn't make sense for Moses to talk to Pharaoh or the Israelites using the name that God calls himself, to say, I am sent me. That sounds kind of weird. And so God gives him a second name. He calls himself Yahweh. And Yahweh is similar to Hayah. It means he is a little bit more than it means I am. They almost mean the same thing, but it's more like he is than I am. And that makes a bit more sense. But he is what? I am what? Well, later on, Jewish people wouldn't say the name of Yahweh out loud due to a misunderstanding of the first commandment in the Ten Commandments. And so to help the priests not say Yahweh out loud when they're reading the scriptures like the one that we're reading today, they would shorten Yahweh to just the consonants, YHWY, and then take the Hebrew word for Lord or Master, which is Adonai, and they would take the vowels out of that and put them in between the consonants of Yahweh, and it made a nonsense word that would be pronounced Yahovah. And later on, when they would read this after they had done that signaled to the priests who were reading that they shouldn't say the word Yahweh, they should say Adonai, but they would know that this was a place where it actually said Yahweh. But later on, when early English translators were translating Hebrew into English, they didn't know that it was a nonsense word, so they just translated it phonetically. And the version that we came up with was Jehovah. And so we now actually call God Jehovah sometimes. You may have even heard pastors or church people do that sometimes, where they'll call him Jehovah. And it's kind of funny because that was originally a nonsense word. It didn't mean anything. It was meant to stop the scribe or the priest from actually saying that word. They wouldn't say Yahweh. They wouldn't say Yahovah. They would stop and say Adonai instead. But now we have the word Jehovah as a result of that. And in fact, you can tell when this happens in your Bible by looking for wherever the word Lord is capitalized. If the word Lord is in all caps rather than little caps anywhere, if the whole word is capitalized, then that's the name Yahweh. And probably in the some of the early copies of Scripture would have been written as Yahovah, so that the priest wouldn't actually say the name of God out loud, which I think is kind of cool. So when you're reading and you see Lord in all caps, that is Yahweh. Or if you hear the names of God, like Jehovah Rapha, which means the God who heals, or Jehovah Shammah, the God who is there, or Jehovah Sidkenu, which is the God who is our righteousness, or one of my favorites, Jehovah Mekadishkim, the God who sanctifies you, or Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides. When you hear those, or you see Lord in all caps, remember that Jehovah or Lord is actually the word Yahweh. Because Yahweh means He is. He is provider. He is healer. He is sanctifier. He is redeemer. He is whatever you need Him to be. If you need Him to be with you like Moses did, He is Yahweh Shammah. If you need Him to provide like Abraham did, He is Yahweh Jireh. If you need Him to sanctify you, He is Yahweh Mekadishkim. He is. His name is Yahweh, and He is what you need Him to be. That is the name of your God. And so Moses gets the name that he's supposed to tell Pharaoh when he confronts him. And so that helps a little bit, but he still has more questions. And so he says, what if they don't believe me and will not obey me, but say the Lord did not appear to you? So the Lord asked him, "What is that in your hand?" "A staff," he replied. Then he said, "Throw it on the ground." He threw it on the ground, and it became a snake. Moses ran from it, but the Lord told him, "Stretch out your hand and grab it by the tail." So he stretched out his hand and he caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. So God tells Moses, if they don't believe that I sent you, throw your staff on the ground and it will turn into a snake. And the Egyptians are very superstitious, and so they might be convinced by that. But Moses still had another question. He says, "Please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, either in the past or recently, since you've been speaking to your servant, because I am slow and hesitant in speech." Yahweh said to him, "Who made the human mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, Yahweh? Now go, I will help you speak, and I will teach you what to say." In other words, but God, I stutter. I stutter. My mouth, my speech is slow, and I'm not eloquent. And God just responds with, "Didn't I make your mouth? Don't worry about it. I'll make the words come out of your mouth just fine." And then Moses finally lets out the real reason for all the questions, and it's something that maybe you've asked God before too. Moses said, "Please, Lord, send someone else. Please, Lord, send someone else." Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, "Isn't Aaron the Levite your brother? I know that he can speak well, and also he is on his way now to meet you. He will rejoice when he sees you. You will speak with him and tell him what to say. I will help both you and him to speak, and will teach you both what to do. He will speak to the people for you." So even though Moses had tested God's patience and had made him angry with all of his questions, God still gave him what he needed, because he is Yahweh. I am whatever you need. So Moses' brother Aaron ends up being Moses' spokesperson, and he spoke for Moses to Pharaoh. And when they did, he said, "This is what Yahweh, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival for me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh responded, "Who is Yahweh that I should obey him by letting Israel go? I do not know anything about Yahweh, and besides, I will not let Israel go." So instead of letting the Israelites go, he added more work to their labor and made it intentionally hard for them. He increased the number of bricks that they had to make, and then didn't let them use the straw that they needed to be able to make the bricks. So Moses goes back to God, and he's like, basically, "Hey, your plan isn't working, so what are we going to do now?" He didn't let them go. He just made it harder for them. And God promises that he's going to make his plan work, and they will be set free from Egypt, and just to trust him. And there in that promise, he says, for the very first time, that he's going to redeem his people. It's the first time the word redeem is used in a promise from God. You won't find it before this in Scripture. He says, "Therefore tell the Israelites, I am Yahweh, and I will deliver you from the forced labor of the Egyptians and free you from slavery to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and great acts of judgment." The fact that God promises to redeem his people with an outstretched arm and a great act of judgment ought to be reason to call to mind for you Jesus, who redeemed with outstretched arms as God poured out his judgment on him in order to redeem us. But at the time, Moses didn't know about Jesus, and so this promise needed an immediate fulfillment. And so God says, basically, I'm going to deliver the Israelites out of Egypt. And I'm going to do that by pouring out my judgment on the Egyptians for how badly that they had treated the Israelite people. So Moses and Aaron pleaded with Pharaoh again, and he does the staff thing, and it turns into a snake. But then Pharaoh's magicians replicate that, and their staffs turn into snakes. But then Moses' snake eats their snakes and then turns back into a staff. It's a wild story. You should go read it for yourself. But even with all that, Pharaoh wouldn't listen. He hardened his heart, and he wouldn't let the Israelites go. And so God begins to send plagues on Egypt. And after each plague, Pharaoh has yet another opportunity to let the people go and prevent the next plague. 10 times he has the opportunity to let the people go, and so that there wouldn't have to be suffering in Egypt. But he chose not to every single time. And these 10 plagues were actually direct attacks on the Egyptian gods. It was a message from Yahweh to Pharaoh to let him know that he's actually in charge and that he better listen and that he better let God's people go. The first plague was that the Nile River turned to blood, which was an attack on the Egyptian god Hapi, which was the god of the Nile. And then the next one was frogs, and frogs were everywhere, all over everything. I don't mind a few frogs, but a whole lot that's disgusting and gross. And that was an attack on the Egyptian god Heket, who was the fertility goddess, who had a frog head, a head of a frog. And then the dust started turning into gnats, which was an attack on Geb, who was the god of the earth. And then there was the death of the cattle and livestock, which was attacking Hathor, who was the goddess of love and protection, and she had the head of a cow. And then there was the ashes that when they touched the Egyptian skin, they would turn into boils and sores. And this was significant because of the Egyptian god Isis, who was the god of medicine and peace. And Egyptian priests would take and throw ash on to the Egyptians to give them the peace of Isis. And this time, the ash caused boils and sores all over their skin. And then there was hail and fire from the sky, which maybe was lightning. They called lightning fire from the sky, so it could have been that. Could have been comets, could have been something straight from heaven, supernatural. We don't know, but that's what they called it. And that was an attack on the Egyptian god Nut, the goddess of the sky. And then there were the locusts, which caused all sorts of disorder all over Egypt, which was an attack on the Egyptian god Seth, which was the god of disorder. And then there were the 3 days of darkness, which attacked the most powerful god in Egypt, Ra, who was the sun god. And it reminds us of Jesus' death on the cross, when darkness covered the land when Jesus died, and then Jesus went into a dark tomb for 3 days, just like there was darkness over Egypt for 3 days. So we see one of the first hints of a foreshadowing of Jesus in this story. And then there was the final and worst plague, because even after all that, Pharaoh wouldn't let the people go. And so God sends the Spirit to kill the firstborn child of every household in Egypt. And the only households that were spared were the ones that had the blood of the Passover lamb on the door. It was called the Passover lamb because it was part of the Passover feast. It was called the Passover feast because the Spirit would pass over the houses that were marked with the blood of the lamb and not pour out his judgment by killing the firstborn son. Now remember, this is being done to the households of those who killed the sons of God's people. These were evil people that this was happening to. We think of God as a God of love, and so hearing this might be hard for you. But remember that God is also a just God. And these people had killed probably millions of Hebrew babies, of their sons. And so God avenges their deaths in this final plague. But the Spirit passed over any house that was marked by the blood of the Lamb, just like God's judgment passes over you if you are marked with the blood of Jesus spiritually through baptism. So finally, when Pharaoh heard the weeping all across Egypt, and the people pressured him to let the Israelites go because they had lost so much at this point, the Egyptians got to leave. The Israelites got to leave Egypt. And they plundered the Egyptians on their way out. And people of other nationalities and ethnicities joined them on their way out. And they headed out into the desert. And God went in front of them during the day as a pillar of cloud to give them shade from the desert sun, and at night as a pillar of fire to give them light and warmth in the cold desert nights. But once the Israelites had gone out of Egypt, Pharaoh basically just changed his mind, and he sent an army after them to go and bring them back. And the Israelites ended up being stuck between the Red Sea and the Egyptians. And here's what happened. It says the angel of God who was going in front of the Israelite forces moved and went behind them. The pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and stood behind them. It came between the Egyptian and Israelite forces. The cloud was there in the darkness, yet it lit up the night. So neither group came near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back with a powerful east wind all that night and turned the sea into dry land. So the waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with the waters like a wall to them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians set out in pursuit, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen, and went into the sea after them. Then during the morning watch, the Lord looked down on the Egyptian forces from the pillar of fire and cloud and threw them into confusion. He caused their chariot wheels to swerve and made them drive with difficulty. "Let's get away from Israel," the Egyptians said, "because Yahweh is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may come back on the Egyptians, on their chariots and horsemen." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. And at daybreak, the sea returned to its normal depth. While the Egyptians were trying to escape from it, the Lord threw them into the sea. And so when the Egyptians were stuck between the sea when the Israelites were stuck between the sea and the Egyptians, God parted the sea so that they could walk through it, closed it back up over the Egyptians so that their captors could no longer come after them anymore. So they were saved through water, and the things that kept them in bondage were drowned in the sea. That day, all 2 million people worshiped God in the desert, and they wrote a song that you can read in Exodus chapter 15, and it must have been really quite the sight, because not only was everyone singing, but then the prophetess Miriam, who was Aaron's sister, she turned things up a notch when she started singing, and she broke out a tambourine and started the world's longest conga line ever. Well, I don't know if it was a conga line, but that's how I imagine it, because it says, "Then Miriam the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women followed her with their tambourines and danced. Miriam sang to them, 'Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. He has thrown the horse and its rider into the sea.'" Tell that story to your Baptist friends. These people know how to party. And we're going to finish the Exodus story next week, but that's enough for this week. For this week, I want to draw your attention to what has been set up and how it points us to Jesus. Because this functions a lot like an allegory for your life. It's a true story, but can function as an allegory for your life. The Israelites were in slavery with no way out, and they had been that way for a long time. And Jesus tells us in John chapter 8, verse 34, he says, "I assure you, everyone who commits sin is a slave of sin." So we have the same problems the Israelites did. We're slaves. For us, it's to sin. But Jesus tells us why that's a big problem. He says, "A slave does not remain in the household forever, but a son does remain forever." In other words, with sin as your master, it might provide you a house for a little while, a temporary place that might feel a little bit like home, but eventually it's going to kick you out. Eventually, it's going to take its toll. Just like how Pharaoh made the Israelites make bricks and make more and more bricks with less and less straw, sin will always escalate. It will always require more and more of you while giving less and less to you. A slave does not remain in the household forever, but a son does remain forever. So the question is, how do we become sons and daughters? Well, Jesus continues. He says, "Therefore, if the Son sets you free, you really will be free." So we have to be set free by the son of the household. Otherwise, we're just runaways that will get dragged back. Have you ever tried to escape a sin that just keeps dragging you back? Have you ever tried to get out of a bad habit that just keeps sucking you back in? Jesus says that you can't set yourself free. The master of sin will keep dragging you back. But if the Son sets you free, then you're really free. Think about this with the Israelites. Who was it that set the Israelites free? It was the grandson of Pharaoh, the only male descendant of Pharaoh, effectively his only son. With Jesus, it's similar. But with slavery, the house of sin has no son to set us free. There is no grandson of our master of sin to set us free. So the Son of God stepped in, and instead of just setting us free like a runaway, he bought us. He paid the price to buy us out of slavery, to buy us out of the household of sin and bring us into the household of God. But how did he do that? It was the same way that the Israelites were saved from God's judgment in the 10th plague. The blood of the Lamb marked them as someone that God was going to redeem from slavery. And now, Jesus, the one that John the Baptist called the Lamb of God, his blood has marked you as someone that is redeemed by Christ the crucified. When the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, and the Egyptians were sealed off from behind them, and there was no way for them to go and get them and drag them back anymore. They were free indeed. It was a picture of your baptism. In your baptism through water, God leads you to seal you in his promise to redeem you, so that you can never be taken as a slave again. There's so much more to this story, but we're going to have to get to it next week because there's another half of this book still to cover. And we're going to learn about how this new Israelite nation is born and the covenant that God establishes with them at Mount Sinai. And we're going to learn how that relates to the new covenant that Jesus established with us at Mount Calvary. So I'll see you next week. Let me pray for you. Dear God, I pray that you would remind us of where we were without Jesus, without your only Son, that we were slaves to sin, but that Jesus, you set us free. And that our baptism marks us as someone who is redeemed by Christ the crucified, sealed off, never able to be taken captive again. Help us to live as those who are free. In your name I pray.